Everybody, welcome to the Positioning Theory virtual series number 4. We will start out with some brief announcements, and then we'll move on to the talks. So first of all, thank you for allowing us to record today's presentations. And it will be just some brief announcement. The first one is that we have, regarding the handbook, we have all the copy edits have been done, and we have delivered the book back to the publisher. So hopefully it will be out on time on the July the 4th. So that would be great to see it finally out there. The second announcement is that the upcoming conference in the University of Finland of the Positioning Theory registration has been opened, and I will put out some links to the registrations in the chat a little bit later, so you can all register for it. I don't know if Pasi is here, if he has any updates on it.
I don't see him yet, Bo.
He's probably not here then. So yes. And then today we have 2 talks, one by Mariah and Johanna. Felicia and Mariah, and another one by Johanna and Mariah. But the next time we have a talk will be on May the 30th. And the first talk will be about positioning theory as design principle to negotiate rights and duties and center equity and literary research. And it will be by Catherine Frankel from Boston University, Susan Fields from Texas A&M, and Ashley Houston King from Boston University. And the second talk will be examining varieties of positioning, considerations from the past to the present and into the future, by Pauline Harris, University of Southern Australia, and Rick Fisher, Tilia, and then I have to really pronounce it, Rika Maulucci, and Cindy as well, all of them from University of Wyoming. So we hope you all register for that one as well, which would be very interesting also. But I'm going to finish today and leave it to the presenters we have of today. The first one will be about positioning in science education by Maria Varelas from University of Chicago, and Felicia Mensah from the Teachers College Columbia, and Maria Rivera Maulucci from Barnard College. And the second talk will be about position, emotions, and emotional positioning by Johanna Lönngren from Umeå University and Maria Berge from Umeå University as well. So let me stop sharing and hand over the presentation to Maria, which I think has the slides for the first talk.
Great. Can you all see my slides? Excellent. Thank you so much. Thanks, Bo, and thanks to Cynthia, to Bo, and to Mary for inviting us to be part of this handbook that they all kind of crafted with a lot of care and impatiently await to see it in print. So I'm Maria Varelas, and my colleagues Felicia Mensah and Maria Rivera Maulucci, both at Columbia University at different colleges. And I had the opportunity to think more deeply about positioning theory in our field, science education. So we've been versed in our field for a good number of years now, and we've known that our field has been moving forward towards denouncing deficit framings and embracing and actualizing asset-based and humanizing perspectives of children, youth, families, and communities with various racial and ethno-linguistic identifications. And that there has been some attention to positioning constructs along the way. So for today's short presentation, we'll dance in and out of sharing some highlights of our chapter. And I'll get us started by sharing first the agenda. So we'll talk a little bit about the goal we had for this chapter, the analytical approach that we used, 3 themes that emerged, and some concluding thoughts and wonderings. So the goal we had was to explore how positioning theory and its constructs explicitly and implicitly have been used in science education and how they relate to the progression of the field from appropriating to transforming norms, expectations, storylines, and positions to shift cultures of power and challenge racial, linguistic, and epistemic hierarchies. Shifts that we think that our own work, like the three of us, have been contributing to. So the approach theory we used centered on 6 prominent journals in our field. You see them really on the slide. Journal of Research in Science Teaching, Science Ed, International Journal of Science Ed, Research in Science Ed, Cultural Studies of Science Ed, and Journal of Science Teacher Ed. And we looked at the last 20 years from 2000 to 2021. And we conducted 3 searches that led us to create 2 data sets. In data set 1, we put all the studies we found that mentioned both positioning theory and Hare. In data set B, we mentioned, we put studies that mentioned Hare, but not really positioning theory explicitly. And there were studies also that, there were no studies that actually mentioned position theory without mentioning Hare as it's one of its fathers. So we used theme A to derive data set A to derive themes, and then we use data set B to kind of further enhance those themes. So I'll pass it now along to Felicia.
Hello, everyone. So after we were able to look at the different A's and B's, we identified 3 themes that capture how science education researchers use positioning theory and what this research contributes to our understanding in the field of science education, as we also look at issues of equity and justice. So we have these 3 themes that you see there on the slide. Theme 1, storylines and identities reconstituted during social interactions. Theme 2, agency and positioning theory triad. And then theme 3 is power, positionings, and racialized and or gender storylines. So we will talk about each of these different themes in turn. We'll be going back and forth almost like a tennis match, but a third player. Go back and forth and give you some associated sub-themes with each of these and also some brief research examples. So I'm going to talk about theme number 1. Storylines and identities reconstituted during social interactions. So Brownwin Davis and Ram Hare define positioning as a discursive practice whereby selves are located in conversations and where participants are also jointly produced in these storylines. In addition, storylines are constantly challenged, negotiated, and transformed in social interactions, and they contribute to the production of roles that are expected in particular contexts. So there can be several different storylines at the same time in a social episode, and there could be also disagreement on what these storylines mean as we think about social reality and the production of negotiations between the different storylines. So roles also play a part. So roles associated with various identities are also shaped, and were shaped by what Mary McVie called role-based positioning. Those storylines are created along with the positions and discourse actions and acts. And we found in the studies for this particular first theme that storylines were influenced by a number of different factors and also contexts, such as participants' identities, teacher identities during pre-service education, student identities, perhaps in a physics community classroom, and also framings of expert versus inquiry during interviews aimed at assessing students' knowledge and reason. So just various different ways of being able to look at this in the context of social interaction. So there are also 3 identified sub-themes for the storyline that talks about identities reconstituted during social interactions. These 3 are teachers' consequential roles in shaping positioning in the classroom, competence, uncertainty, and resilience in storylines and identities, and in multimodality and its affordances and nuance in storylines and identities. So I'm going to talk about each of the different sub-themes and give you an example. Am I echoing? Okay. Okay, the host muted me. Okay. An example, the first sub-theme of teachers' consequential role in shaping positioning in the classroom, we want to look at the work of Mi-Jeon Kim as an example. In Kim's work, she examined how 15 students in grades 4, 5, and 6 and their teacher in a classroom in Western Canada positioned themselves in science learning contexts and developed science identities through classroom interactions. The teacher's positioning of the students as learners was deliberate and distinctive for developing their capacity to think like scientists within the complexity and requirements of a mandated curriculum. It created new storylines that defined scientists as collaborative problem solvers and knowledge seekers and tied those qualities with feelings of excitement, frustration, and perseverance. As the teacher moved from answering students' questions to facilitating their ownership of problem solving in this inquiry-based science classroom, there were conflicts and negotiation of the science identities that also had to be considered. For the second sub-theme, we looked at confidence, uncertainty, and resilience in storylines and identities. And this relates to conceptions of what counts as competence and the role of uncertainty and understanding, as well as the resilience to resist structural oppression in the construction of storylines and identities and social interactions in and out of various educational spaces and places. So as an example, we looked at the work of Jessica Watkins, David Hammer, Jennifer Radoff, Lama Jabbar, and Anna Phillips, who looked at the development of productive identities in science and this idea of not understanding as central to scientific work in science education and school science. In other words, the storylines emerged in classroom interactions where students' confusions were validated and are used to initiate or sustain the class engagement in science inquiry. As positions of not understanding are a meaningful part of disciplinary work, the storylines that celebrate uncertainty shape students' trajectories of science identity construction. Then in our third sub-theme looks at multimodality and its affordances of nuance in storylines and identities. So work of Eli Tucker Raymond and my colleague here, Maria Varelas, Christine Pappas, Ala Quartz, and Ashley Wintland examine and explore multimodalities of narratives of 36 first, second, and third grade children, and these were mainly children of color, for their conceptions of being scientists across 3 different times in a school year. They did drawings and had speech, created the storylines that captured their emotions, their actions, positions, and epistemological stances. And all of this reveals some very sophisticated thinking and feeling that the children were able to do. So considering identities as the accumulations of the daily stories and positions that result from our daily interactions with others and change as we gain new experiences, the authors in this work show how young children's science identities support and are supported by particular storylines of science and school science. Thus, attending to multimodality discourses increases research potential for capturing the complexities, the crevices, and hidden aspects of storylines and identities as they are shaped in social interactions.
Maria, are you coming in?
I started talking without turning my audio on. Our second theme is agency and the positioning theory triad. For this theme, we identified 3 sub-themes: the grammar of individual and collective agency and its relation to positioning, teacher agency, teacher actions, and classroom positioning, and finally, youth agency, shifts in positioning, and the creation of new storylines. Here we focus on the agency associated with the freedom humans have to position themselves in social events. Hare argued that positioning occurs when rights and duties are assigned, ascribed, or appropriated and resisted, rejected, or repudiated, thus referring to a dialectical relationship between structures on the one hand, which determine particular rights and duties, and agency on the other, which leads to pushing against structures. While people are not entirely free to position themselves, their agency plays a vital role in all 3 constructs of the positioning theory triad: acts, positions, and storylines. So as an example of our first sub-theme, the grammar of individual and collective agency and its relation to positioning, Jenny Martin and Lynn Carter focused on marginalized pre-service elementary school teachers and their agency with respect to environmental sustainability. They define teacher agency as the positioning of pre-service teachers as responsible for their actions. Zooming in on the case of Iko Karmi, They highlight the use of first-person pronouns I and me as evidence of personal agency and the use of we and us to signal collective agency. Their analysis considered the intended audiences and their understanding of storylines to complete the positioning triad. They found that eco-karmi's self-positions in the public domain as pro-environmentally engaged drew on social and material resources, but primarily embraced an individual rather than collective responsibility for sustainability. For the second subtheme, teacher agency, teacher actions, and classroom positioning, Ulrika Bosser and Mats Lindahl focused on classroom discourse on socioscientific issues, specifically climate change. And they uncovered ways in which teachers' actions in classroom discourse made available or promoted contrasting student positions. So the teacher positioned the students as independent learners for actions in society, yet the students were still very dependent on the teacher for actions in the classroom. The researchers argued that because positions are always relational, teachers position students through teaching and thereby influence students' access to certain spaces for actions. And this is how contrasting storylines unfolded in their study. The third theme focuses on youth agency and shifts in positioning and the creation of new storylines. When young people of color position themselves and are positioned as authors, knowers, doers, and users of science, positions that are not often available for them in science classrooms, the societal and racial structures that deny them access and restrain their agency are disrupted. So in this study that focused on youth of color, Joseph Pullman and Jennifer Hope explored youth's engagement in generating science news for a science journalism project. Over time, the positions the youth were taking or those that were attributed to them shifted from not contributing or unsuccessful in chemistry to having strong academic potential. The published science news stories that they created served as boundary objects that allowed them to cross boundaries and be recognized for their work, while the different storylines of them creating those objects that were valued in their communities were also being developed.
So I'll share some on the last theme. So our last theme focuses on the construct of power, which is fundamentally inequity and justice centered work, both practice and research in science education, as a matter of fact, in all subjects. So in positioning theory, power and its distribution in particular context is the mediating factor determining how the rights and duties of the participants are configured similarly or differently. So given that rights and duties determine positions, actions, acts, and storylines, power is intimately related to notions of justice. So we named this theme Power, Positionings, and Racialized and or Gendered Storylines that helped us capture how science education scholars have explored racial identities and power difference in reflexive and interactive positionings, how gender identities, materiality, and distribution of power in positions and storylines happens, and how intersectional identities are important and the dynamics of power in positioning in space and time. So in science and engineering education settings, race and racial identities have been critical factors in power differentials and how these shape rights and duties, impacting in-the-moment positions and larger storylines present in reflexive and interactive positions. People construct an experience. So as one example, Karim Malone and Gilda Barabino, studying what they called minority graduate students in sciences and engineering at the majority research university, focused on how identity is established through the positioning inside and outside of the lab culture. They shed light on how one's sense of rights and belonging within a social pact and epistemology are compromised within the processes of marginalization. And they argued that this dynamic, in tandem with racialization, perpetuates racial exclusions and disenchantment by minorities with university research. Isolation, marginalization, and invisibility were all linked to these students' lack of power due to their mostly Black racial identities. So the researchers argued that racist attitudes and practices were present in the science and engineering laboratory setting where racial differences implied power differences. And the students' reflexive positionings captured actually this difference. So focusing on gender and power distribution, Gina Weiselman and her colleagues studied how power and positioning in a mixed gender group of sixth graders ebbed and flowed over time, and with the presence of material artifacts during an integrated STEM curricular unit. They showed how equipment like a laser pointer or an audio recorder served as tools of power within the group at various points, and also how power distribution changed when activities changed from more structured science activities to less structured than the engineering ones. So part of this change was attributed to the physical materials used in engineering activities, which prompted the boys to become more involved than shifting the power dynamics across gender roles in the group. So material artifacts had a mediating impact on power and power relations during social interaction between boys and girls who were operating within, of course, larger storylines related to gender and science. Lastly, Carol Brandt explored intersectional identities of 4 indigenous, actually Navajo undergraduate women, both completers and leavers of their science programs, and their reflexive positionings relative to science and scientific discourse. The study showed that lived experiences and traditional knowledges were sources of power for the women, who brought them together at particular spaces and times to define their positions and storylines as they talked about themselves. So the discursive spaces where the women felt supported and able to express themselves as indigenous women were what the author called comfort zones, where relational aspects were emphasized and the women could function with ease and trust. These discursive spaces were also locations of possibility, where indigenous students could imagine how to bring their university education back to their communities, which created possibilities for additional locations of power. So this study showed us how power is distributed differently in different locations, spaces, times, and contexts, where storylines actually refract different social orders. So let me continue with sharing some of our concluding thoughts and wonderings, and Felicia will close us up with the rest. So the studies we briefly outlined in this chapter, which explicitly or implicitly used positioning theory, approached educational acts as situated, cultural and historical, along with interactions among these dimensions. They engaged with how people draw on cultural systems to enact or contest situated and attributed roles, positioning themselves and being positioned by others as certain types of people and not other types of people. These determinations happen at the micro level of interactions that dynamically change over time and space, but also were shaped by macro level discourses and structures that permeate any micro moments, both of them micro and macro being dimensions that positioning theory invites. So these studies also led us to consider dialectical relationships between positions, actions, acts, and storylines. In dialectical relationships, one entity of the relational system is the mediational tool for shaping the other entity in ways that both entities cannot exist and cannot be deeply constructed and understood without each other. So positioning theory, we think, invites researchers to study and shed light on the complex dialectical relationships that underline its constructs in multiple social and educational settings. Specifically, the storyline is a fundamental construct in positioning theory, and the various studies we engage with support this idea as the construct of storylines permeates all the themes that emerged in our analysis and that we briefly shared today. In science education, storylines are used to interpret interactional episodes, but they are also being created or reshaped by them, implicitly or explicitly, linking the past with the present and the future. So positioning theory, the position theory construct of storyline seems to have the potential to encourage researchers to explore the interplay of micro and macro storylines and the role of social forces in shaping them.
Mhm. So then as we continue to think about positioning theory in science education, there are some other ideas of research that other scholars have done to help us to think about it. So for example, Nikki Slocum Bradley proposed a positioning theory diamond instead of a triangle. The positioning theory diamond includes 4 elements: rights and duties, identities, social forces, and storylines. And in the diamond, various elements of the positioning theory are made much more explicit, so they can be juxtaposed and dialectically interact with other elements. Several years later, Mary McVie, Kate Hoke, Nicole Barrett, Katerina Silvestri, I think I saw Katerina online, Lynn Shanahan expanded on Slocum Bradley's diamond. While time often appears to be linear when analyzing episodes of positioning that include narrative, these researchers emphasize a discourse that is often recursive as narrators flash ahead and flash back as a positioning episode unfolds and is narrated in the current moment. So this idea of space and time. So this expanded positioning theory diamond captures non-linear trajectories of positioning, reflecting an array of relationships across time. Positions are constructed and represented not only through speech, but also through speech acts, other acts, multimodalities, and artifacts. In science education, research becomes more visible and therefore more explorable. Constructs such as subjectivities versus identities, multiple identities, and the dynamic intersectionalities create possibilities for further inquiry in science education research. Then, as Zachary Warren and Fathali Mandagdam noted, rights and duties are not only central to social justice, but are also routinely disputed as part of larger discussions on social justice. So by interrogating rights and duties and the associated social forces that underlie the construction of positions, identities, storylines, acts, and actions, offers possibilities for science education research to shed new light on this dynamic relationship of rights and duties vis-a-vis social justice and science education. So as we think about science education research, is moving much more towards exposing and challenging norms and expectations based on this kind of alignment with racial, ethnic, linguistic, gender, and epistemic hierarchies. It is also attempting to move much closer to humanizing perspectives that disrupt the fatal coupling of difference and power, which Stuart Hall talks about and has noted power disparities. So positioning theory can be leveraged in these kinds of relationships. And given that the classroom is an essential, but it's not the only space and place for learning in science education, interrogating elements of positioning theory and their relationships could provide many more insights into how the classroom, and with all of its limitations, still remains a location of possibility, as Bell Hooks talks about, not just for the few, but also for those who are privileged and power and those who have not had opportunity to engage in this kind of research, or for researchers to look at it in these various ways. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. We will take questions after the second talk. So, but again, thank you, Mariah, Felicia, Mariah, 2 times Mariah. So I think we'll move on to the second talk by Johanna and Mariah as well. If you're ready.
Yes. Thank you so much. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Great. What an exciting presentation to be paired up with. Thank you so much. I'm really, really excited about all the references as well that you mentioned, and look forward to digging deeper into that. Our chapter is called Positioning, Emotions, and Emotional Positioning. And while Maria and I have written the chapter, I also want to acknowledge the other team members that work in our project, which are Katarina Günther, who's also here today, and Johan Holmén from Chalmers University of Technology, because we all together work on emotional positioning in engineering education. Briefly, what I want to talk about, a little bit about theories of emotion to give a background, and then how and why emotions and positioning are related to each other. We'll present an analytic framework for analyzing emotional positioning, and then present 4 visions for future research on emotional positioning. And we will illustrate those with examples from our ongoing research. So our contribution is more of a theoretical, conceptual contribution than an empirical in itself. We start with the emotions. There's no agreement whatsoever on what emotions are and how we define them. But there's the one model that most theorists can kind of agree on, and that is that emotions consist of different components, where the gestures, the motor expression, that what we do with our bodies is one part. But we also have the neurophysiology, which can be like heart rate or sweating or other bodily symptoms. Action tendency, emotions are like evolutionary. The evolutionary basis is that they are designed to make us want to do something or not to do something. So there is a motivation and action tendency in emotions. The subjective experience is how we perceive the emotion by ourselves, and then we make cognitive appraisal of the experience. But then the interesting part is that there are two overarching types of emotion theories where like the everyday understanding that most of us use in Western cultures is the cognitive appraisal approach to emotions, where we think of emotions as something that we as individuals have and experience and express. So if we want to see, if we want to study emotions, then we need to know what is inside people's heads. But when we look from positioning theory perspective, we look at social interaction. So, and from those kinds of theories, emotions are, we don't look at what people really feel or what they really experience. We look at what they express and how emotions are interpreted and reacted to in social interaction. And then we can analyze emotions by looking at interaction and positioning. But what we've noticed both for ourselves and when we talk to others is that because it's so ingrained in us that we think of emotions as something that's somewhere in here, it really requires us to constantly remind ourselves that we're not thinking of emotions as I have an emotion, but we're doing an emotion in interaction. So what does this really have to do with positioning? When we look through the literature on positioning and emotions, we found three types of main arguments that come from different branches of the tree of positioning theory that Mary McVie and colleagues have developed. And the first one comes more from the base and the critical discourse analysis perspective, saying that when we position each other, that can trigger emotions. So positioning process, because they're related to power relations, for example, they make people express emotions. The second one comes from two branches, both Mika Bamberg and Harry Langenhove Mogadam, focusing on how communication acts and moral orders can contribute to positioning people as emotional or unemotional, and that then has consequences for how we interact further and power relations. And then the third one is that we can use emotions as resources in positioning and thereby exercising social control. So our conclusions on that we also found in the literature is positioning theory is a useful tool for analyzing emotions, but also emotions are a useful tool for studying positioning. And we're going to talk a bit about both of those. So the analytic framework is the basic triangle. We've just translated that to looking at emotions. But maybe the important part here is that we talk about emotion acts, but it's not like emotion acts are a different kind of communication act, but it's more, we look at communication acts or speech acts through the perspective of emotions. So it's more of an analytic perspective on communication acts, because all communication is emotional. There's always emotions. We can't take them out of what we do. And then we've defined emotional positioning as either positioning through emotions, so we express emotions and thereby position somebody, or we position someone as emotional, unemotional, rational, or irrational. And the reason that we have rational or irrational here is that in the context of engineering education, we don't see people talking about emotions. We see people talking about rationality. So we needed to have that contrast to what is not emotion. Maria.
And this is linking on to what you said before, Felicia, Maria, that power is, of course, very important here. And for example, Sarah Ahmed has pointed out how emotions are really related to power. And certain people are positioned as emotional, which is not very good when you are an engineer, and some people are not, although they might do emotions in a similar way. So to remember to have a power perspective when we think about emotional positioning is so important. And we have kind of 4 visions when we wrote this chapter, and this is the first one, and that is like remember the power perspective when we think about emotional positionings. And now I mentioned like negative emotions, that you can be too emotional as an engineer. No, wait, please go back. And that I would say we'll easily forget that happiness is an emotion too. And happiness is also a form of showing value. This is shown in science education, for example. So let's take an example from our Emote project, where Johanna Lönngren is PI. We have looked at engineering students solving sustainability problems together. And here is a little part of that. Student 3 is an engineering student, and he's talking about Ulf. Or for you who are not Swedish, Ulf is our prime minister. And what student 3 has done is that he has seen a debate the night before, and he wants to talk politics. And he's trying to do that for a long time. But he does it in a very, in a kind of humorous way. So it's not clear if he's trying to be fun or not. But here he's saying that Ulf, the prime minister, he was actually not the prime minister at that time. Ulf pointed out in the debate that the wind doesn't blow all the time. And they are talking about different energy sources here. And then student 2 is saying, that's actually true, fair point indeed. And they all start laughing together. And they're doing the emotion of happiness together. And they're positioning this as a happy moment. And this is a very common way. You can find this kind of humor in many contexts, that we do make fun of politicians. But then the discussion continues. And student 4 is saying, damn, I've really been thinking about it. It's like if we just told all engineers who build wind turbines, then we could. And here interesting positionings are made, because what's happening here, he's bringing in the engineers. They are something different from the politicians. The engineers are the clever one who knows about wind and energy, in contrast to the politicians. And then student 1 says, but what? We could just place the wind turbines against each other so it blows backwards. And here I could have made an even more nuanced transcript. Johanna will talk about transcripts later. But what's happening here is that she's really nailing it here. They all find this super fun here. They're all doing happiness together. And then student 2 and student 1 and student 4 build on that joke and saying kind of the same thing, like making stupid engineering ideas together. And this is a common way to do humor, that you build on humor. Is actually student 1 who is inventing this humor. And they are like exploding with happiness and laughter. They are clever. They understand how energy works, and the politicians don't. But when we bring in a power perspective, and when we bring in what Johanna said before, that in engineering discourse, it's not really allowed to be emotional. What does it mean? And we think here it's important to have a power perspective and an identity perspective on what's said.
Thank you, Maria. So I'll go on to the second vision, where we focused on multimodality, where we think that if we focus on emotional positioning, then that is also a way to strengthen the multimodality in positioning theory research, because that is a very strong upcoming type of research in positioning theory. And if we go back to the emotion components that I mentioned in the beginning, then we can see different kinds of empirical signs that we can use to study those kinds of components. The motor expression, as I said, it's gestures, facial expressions, body movement. Physiology would require sensors for sweating or shaking or heart rate. The action tendency, we can also look at how bodies move, how they move together, how they turn the bodies towards each other or from each other, but also with artifacts. And then we have maybe the more classical ones that positioning theory has tended to explore, which are more the discursive aspects, where we can look at the subjective experience, like I feel ashamed, you are angry, but also the value discourse, the cognitive appraisal, where we say those politicians, they are stupid, the engineers are smart, this tea that Maria is just drinking is tasty, for example. And then we decided to not only look on those, but also look at the motor expressions and the action tendency. We don't have the equipment for the neurophysiology, unfortunately, but I think that would also be an exciting direction to further explore, to get the more broader perspective of multimodality. So here's one example just to look at how we transcribe, and here the text in the black is what they say. It's the verbal discourse, and it's a very small part actually of the whole transcript, what they say, and we haven't even transcribed everything. We really only have transcribed the types of gestures and body movements that express emotions very clearly. And this is a very, very nice scene where one student suggests a solution to the sustainability problem that requires them to let go of control and focus on how people relate to each other and to technology. And then she's like, oh, this is a tickly feeling. Do we really dare to do that? So it's a really strong gestures and physical expressions. And then on the other side, there's more the worrying aspect, but yeah, it's like then that feels like we're putting trust in this relatedness thing, so it's more hesitant and more worrying expressions with the body as well. And if we look at positioning, then on the left side, the student very clearly positions both themselves and the group as excited and daring, which then allows them to actually go into the uncertainty and keep working with that. And we use the theory of expansive learning in our research, which means that they can do something new, something they haven't been able to do before, that isn't normal for engineering students to do. And then on the other side, the student positions themselves and the group more as, if we focus on relatedness, then are we blindly trusting? Maybe we should be worried instead about what can happen. And this position facilitates critical reflection, but it can also hinder the students from engaging with the uncertainty because they instead focus on the control. So there's the connection between the emotions, the positioning, and the possibilities for learning. Which brings us to the third vision, where we notice that much of the research so far has not been directly connected to practice. and developed concrete tools and guidance for how we can change and improve practice, which is what we want to do in our project. So we use the concept of emotional scaffolding to try to think about how can we use positioning, the results from our positioning analysis to improve engineering education and open up new avenues of learning for our students. And emotional scaffolding in our work in progress definition is to construct the emotional conditions that can facilitate the type of learning that we think these students need. And again, we have the two sides here, where one is the emotional positioning as worried and having to be in control, and the other one is positioning as excited and we don't need the control. And those are related to how the students frame the situation, the learning situation. So if they're excited, they frame the situation as an opportunity. They can do something new, they can co-create something new together, they have agency. While when they position themselves as worried, they frame the situation as a challenge and as a problem and something that they don't really know how to deal with. They realize that purely rational approaches are not enough to deal with sustainability challenges, but that's problematic because it requires them to let go of control. So the idea here is that we try to figure out how can we use emotional scaffolding to help the students frame the situation not as a challenge, but as an opportunity. But then the question is also, do we attack, so to speak, the framing? Do we help them to reframe, or do we help them to change the emotional positioning, which then can change the framing? So it's like a continuum, and we don't really know yet where it's most useful to address the situation. Yes, and here are just some examples of what we've seen in the data, what the students do themselves as well. When they normalize frustration, that's a kind of scaffolding which positions them as courageous and not having to be in control, and allows them to engage with uncertainty. And similarly, if they build trust and relatedness in the group, they position themselves and each other as belonging and collaborating, and they're strong together rather than individually, which also allows them to engage with other diverse challenges that they encounter in their work. And the fourth vision, Maria.
Yes, thank you. As Johanna mentioned in the beginning, we are not only thinking that emotions and emotional perspective is important to bring into positioning theory, we also think that, positioning theory can be so helpful for emotion research. And first of all, we do believe that position theory can highlight importances of social and cultural aspects. That is what we can see in motion research. They are so focused on what's happening within the brain that they lose kind of where emotions are happening for real. And secondly, we do think that position theory can contribute to developing more interdisciplinary approaches. And that's very much needed in our view. And third, we do positioning theory can contribute to develop a more situated understanding of emotions. No emotions happened in a box. And here I would like to connect to what you talked about before about micro and macro discourses. That's the beauty of positioning theory, that we can work with the micro and think of the macro at the same time. Emotion research can learn from that.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to show the references so they're on the video if anybody wants to look up any of those. But I'll stop sharing there, and I'm really curious about the discussion also with the first presentation.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for another really, really interesting and thoughtful presentation. Let's open the virtual space for comments and questions for the two presentations. Anyone?
Bo, may I start?
Yes, sure.
Thank you. First of all, both sets of presentations were absolutely fascinating. Thank you both. That what an engaging set of presentations. A quick question for the second group of presenters. I wonder, Johanna and Maria, if you could talk about the possibility, 'cause I was thinking about your discussion regarding implications of this important work that you're doing for work with engineering students. And I wonder, and I'm going to be honest, I can't remember which chapter in the handbook this was, but one set of chapter authors talked about the importance of using positioning work in the moment to reframe the way events unfold. And I did wonder about the possibility of using some of those examples that you gave with engineering students in the moment to involve them in making decisions about how reframing might impact the outcome of what's happening in the moment. I wonder if you could speak to that.
Yes, we have actually looked at that from the perspective of emotional scaffolding, but because that builds on the positioning analysis insights, I think it's still very connected. And the idea is that the teacher, because the emotions are so situated and so specific in the situation, and the challenges are so situated, and the students are at different levels and in different situations, it's almost impossible for a teacher to know how to support a group when they just come in and see the group and something is going on. The group is laughing or the group is shouting or whatever. And we also saw that the same kind of emotion expressions could lead to very different outcomes. It could hinder them from engaging with uncertainty, or it could facilitate engaging with uncertainty. So then we had the idea that maybe we can provide a kind of written instructions for the students that when this happens, please take a stop, take a break, and think about what is happening here in terms of emotions, in terms of positioning. They won't understand the theory behind positioning, but we can reframe it. We did try to tell them that when you notice strong emotions, stop and reflect. That didn't work. They need more help than that.
Great, thanks. I think there's a question in the chat, perhaps. Question for the second presentation from Kulut. If I want to use the emotional positioning theory in an online interview, do you think that will enrich the theory or it will weaken it?
I'm not sure what kind of interviews that
I think
refers to.
the person wants to ask about using positional theory and as emotional positioning theory. If you do that through an online interview or something like that, whether that could be possible.
I think so. I think we do emotion so much with our voices. And I think that can be important and knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And laughter is an example that you can look out for. And laughter can show many different things.
So thing, I mean, we lose a lot of information, of course, because we only see this little box of a person, but maybe we can instruct also the person to move away a bit so we see more of the body and focus on what we do with our hands or our face or things like that. So I think it's definitely possible. We also have analyzed a little bit of Zoom recorded data, which also was helpful.
This is me. I'm just wondering if I want to do only one interview, do you think that I can use this theory, or because it's only one interview about emotion that you have been through when you send your research paper in Q1 journals. So what was your emotion? Did you do it again? Stuff like that. Do you think I can use this theory, apply it for this kind of research?
I think so. We're using it, so. But I'd be very curious to hear how it works for you.
Maria, it looked like you had your hand up a moment ago too.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Cynthia. Thank you, Johanna and Maria, for your work. So I was wondering two things. One is, as you were talking about what teachers can be doing in classrooms, I picture teachers I work with that sometimes they will say, how does this make you feel, right? So stop in the moment, right? Not necessarily writing or spending a lot of time, but giving really, students, learners, young people, opportunity to really just describe, which makes me kind of think of the second point when Johanna, you were saying that we don't have the tools to capture the neurophysiology really directly. I was wondering if really getting people to describe those feelings, right, a little bit, will give us a proxy to the neurophysiology, the way that they sense it, the way that they feel it, as opposed to the way a sensor I put on my pulse on my wrist here captures my heartbeat going up and down when I'm excited or when I'm sad. So I wonder if the agency of the humans right there can also be used to interpret the situation, but really focus specifically on the physiological sensing of that emotion at the moment. So just a couple of thoughts that were kind of generated as you so beautifully pulled the emotional emphasis, really the emotional scaffolding and the emphasis on emotions in your work.
That's a very good question. So in the literature on studying emotions, there's a lot of talk about self-report emotions. So people talking about their own emotions as being very unprecise because people don't always know what they feel. And I would expect that the physiological aspects are often unconscious. So we'd have to directly prompt people. What's your heart rate right now? Or how much are you sweating right now? Or those kinds of questions which could be a bit disruptive maybe. I saw a comment in the chat, maybe use smartwatches. So there is equipment, definitely, and there are people doing that research. It's just we don't have it in our project. And it's harder if you do it with many students at the same time. Because we had like 12 students at the same time every time we collected data.
I was thinking of the work of Alberto Bellocci in science education. He has done very rigorous work where they self-reported and also observed and in his projects. But maybe we are more interested in the collective emotions, Johanna and I. I'm not. What are the emotions we do together?
I think that's a power of position theory, as you keep underscoring, right? I mean, it's at the collectivity level, both to kind of have this dialectical relation between the individual and the collective, and how they negotiate, and in what ways this idea of positioning themselves and positioning each other, and so that's the beauty, I think, of position theory, allowing us to do exactly multiple levels of reference for us to be thinking about.
I have a question about the emotions as well, because I'm thinking Rom did some of his work I think with Jared Parrots in the 90s, I think it was. One of the books was called The Social Construction of Emotions. So I was just thinking about whether there's anything from that literature in terms of Rom's development of his thinking leading into positional theory, which goes into the emotional theories of emotions as well, as a serving as some sort of a background for emotional positioning as the way you conceive it.
Certainly, yeah. We've built quite a lot on that in our thinking for our theory.
Okay.
I have a question to your first presentation, if I may.
Yes, sure.
So I was really excited to hear talk about both agency and materiality, artifacts. And I was wondering if you could say a little more about how that played out, because we really also saw that artifacts could help the students, like if they just hold a water bottle, that could really calm them down and give them agency to also engage. So if you could say a little more on that.
Sure, I'll jump in since that was a theme 3 that I presented, and then Felicia and Maria can add. So there are not really that many studies in science education. Something we didn't say, but it's in the chapter, about 16, 17 studies that we put in data set A and about 17 that we put in data set B. So for 20 years in really major science education, there are not really that many who explicitly, right, either bring, some references that kind of get us thinking, oh, positioning theory, even if they don't explicitly mention it as part of the theoretical framing, or they explicitly do that. So there's limited kind of work. So there's other work in science education that is bringing out materiality as an important idea of learning and interacting with each other. And I think it would be really beautiful to put positioning theory in conversation with this kind of research. There is a very recent issue in RSTE, the Research in Science and Scientific and Technological Education, that was a special issue on materiality, really, and multimodality. So, not that many of us even use there. There's some reference to positioning theory, but so the idea that the material itself, right, has the capacity, and actually some of our indigenous knowledge colleagues and scholars are really thinking about materials have agency too, right? It's not only people who have agency, but materials have agency. Nature has agency. The world around us in inanimate forms has agency because it kind of pushes and to be thinking as humans in kind of particular ways. So we saw in that study I presented, really Wiseman study, that the students themselves reconfigured really who has power, who gets to be doing stuff, who does the thing, right? And not only has emotions, knowledges, reasoning, justifications, and all this stuff together, but really who is control of this material, right? I mean, who is really holding the laser pointer? Who is holding the paper where they're gonna do a drawing? Who is really controlling a kind of a group to get up and do something as part of this, which I really want to, link with Johanna's and Maria's presentation, because at a certain point, really, you said, I think it was Johanna who said, really, who's in control? So being in control, right? Then you link that to if you kind of see yourself or abdicating being in control, you start trusting uncertainty, and power dynamics allow you to do that or not. So it's I think a beautiful connection for me to see how the material really mediates this kind of both power and certainty and uncertainty and control and not in control kind of relations. So I don't know if that's helpful to you, Maria. Felicia, jump in, please, and share.
Yeah, the only other thing that I thought about that, because we haven't had much in the research either around the ideas of the intersectional identities of those who have control or not have control. What kinds of materials are set in particular spaces for being able to do this, to do work, to even think about positioning theory in different ways. And so that's another factor to be able to think about. And so, like, I guess we're making connections between both of the papers too. Now, I was very curious to know about setting up the learning environment, that emotional scaffolding, like who's in the environment and who and what was, I'm gonna lose my thought. When you set up emotional scaffolding, who are you setting it up for? And there are differences between who needs it and who does not need it. And so just kind of like all these different ways that classroom environment allows people to come in and out related to that. And then I thought, related to that last idea around positioning theory of the diamond, that the notion of the time factor. So as people go back and think about their learning, what kind of identity and how would they position before, during, and after? And I've been thinking about the engagement can be in a class session or across a semester. You know, as you teach a class, how is that? How are all these ways that students are being positioned, and even how emotions may change in the very beginning I'm going to give a real example. This is what I've been thinking about. Like a class I'm teaching currently, there are lots of emotions that are going through the class and how students are taking up the content. And last evening for class, some students started sharing about what their emotions were in the beginning and what they are now. And so I tried to capture some of that through their writing journals throughout the semester. And I was telling them that I appreciate how much they have been able to share in class, things that they've been grappling around issues of race and social justice and in their learning as teacher educators. So as I listen to the presentations, all this is running around in my head, you know, really think about that connection between the emotions. I've been trying to find a way to talk about it. And so you've given me some ways to think about what that looks like. But I felt like I just was blabbing. But, you know, all of those kinds of things are coming together for me, you know, as I think about the two presentations together.
Great. Any other questions? I have one for the first presentation. I was thinking along something that Cynthia said as well, because you study a lot of using positioning theory as an analytical lens, but since it's also within education, and this is just a thought, could we use it as a pedagogical tool or something like that to actually structure our teaching, like you said, Felicia, in a certain sense as well? Has any one of you kind of like tried that or have any experience with doing that as a way of didactical tool of actually presenting science education or carrying it out?
I'll jump here as Maria and Felicia are getting ready. I think one of the things that the three of us discussed as we've been immersed in this kind of work, but also more work is more kind of centered around the words we use is identities and identity construction. So we spent a lot of time thinking at the beginning, really, that although we haven't been linking positioning theory necessarily very critically to identity, it's an important part of identity, and sometimes it's subsumed in identity research when it comes to science education. So there's no way you can do identity work and study identity work or really support young people in classrooms in any kind of learning settings to do identity work without really considering positioning theory constructs. So some of the work that we've done in the past with our team is really how do we exactly go after identity construction in explicit ways in the classrooms, in the same way that Johanna and Maria talked about emotional scaffolding. How do we do identity scaffolding, right? I mean, and not identity as singular, identity as intersectional, identity as multiple. So when so what does it mean really to get the students at the end of a day, of a week, of a month, whatever time frames are important here, to think about who they are they becoming, how they're positioned by others, who positions them X, why the position. And kids in classrooms say that all the time. They think I'm whatever. I mean, they think I'm whatever is an identity construction, but is a positioning construction too, because there were actions and acts involved and storylines behind these, and identities and rights and duties and all the fundamental elements of positioning theory. So sometimes we take those for granted. So I think we need, my view is that we need research that gets us to the intricacies of all the constructs in positioning theory that feeds into the very complex and messy concept of identities. I'll stop here, and Maria, Felicia, please add.
So I think like I think of a couple of examples in my own teaching, and like Maria was saying, we have researchers, and I would include myself in there. As we were working on this chapter, for me, like I've never explicitly used positioning theory. However, I saw many echoes of positioning theory in the work that I have done. And so, for example, some of my work looks at the journey of new teachers in becoming, justice-oriented science educators. And some of that work looks at how it's there's the theory behind it. And sometimes, my pre-service teachers may resist the theories, right, of justice-oriented or multicultural approaches to teaching science. But when you put them in the role, when you make them do it, then they emerge on the other side of it as, having been in that role and now like fully understanding, having embodied it. Now they understand what it means, to teach for social justice, and wouldn't imagine, doing it a different way. And then similarly, working with students in the classroom and positioning them as knowers and doers of science, positioning them as scientists, and telling them, hey, while you're doing this, you're being a scientist right now, and seeing how them taking on that role, actually, helps them, and then reflecting it back to them, right? That's what, that positionality becomes real to them, and they begin to own it. And so, I've seen this in my work, both with youth and then with, pre-service teachers, what it is that I ask them to do, the identities that I ask them to take on, even if they're tentative about taking on, those roles or identities in the beginning, they begin to afford them, opportunities for just new pathways, new ways of thinking about things, and new ways of sort of acting in the world.
Thank you. I think this is really interesting, because I think it points to what positioning theory has a potential for. I think the concept is consciousness raising, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And then it could be connectable to some of the old standpoint theories also, in terms of developing this kind of critical awareness or consciousness of stuff as well. Yeah, Johanna?
I just wanted to tag on to something you said, Maria, about the embodiment, because I think that is a very, very important aspect. If we want to transfer theory into practice, we need to also help people experience those new positions and not just teach them cognitively. This is
Right.
what you also can have as a position, because that won't change anything, but they have to feel it also in their bodies, physically, and they have to do the emotions that are related to that positioning as well.
Thanks.
And I would like to add, been working with engineering education and physics education on a higher education level, that are problematic positionings that need to be addressed. The male genius idea, not working collectively, needs to be addressed. And that can be, when they do engineering and physics and saying we are geniuses together, they have a nice emotion doing that. Still, we need to problematize that. So I just want to add what Maria talked about, like we have to help them feel like scientists. In the other end of the scale, in higher education, there are other nuances that needs to be added.
And I'll jump in here too and say, I absolutely agree. And it's not only in higher education, I think, Maria. It's really everywhere, right? Because young people kind of have storylines in their minds, right? That have been fed and been socialized into those inside and outside classrooms and inside and outside learning spaces about what people with the designation X do, feel, perform, and engage with the world. So in what ways we problematize those? And I think it was your team that said, really interdisciplinary work can be, helpful here too. And we do some kind of this work now in one of our projects with science theater and bringing the arts-based ways to science ways. And you can see really the struggle of the teachers and the students really in embracing arts, but that's not really necessarily what science people do. And when we unpack really, but science people actually, act it out to see how it works or it doesn't work this way. Is that art? Is that science? Is it an art science space that is actually more productive for us to think about instead of developing disciplinary boundaries constantly from young children like preschoolers and continuing that journey all the way up there in the world, of schooling, academy, or whatever it is that we're playing around. So that's exactly very important, right? Because there is the notion that arts makes you feel good and science makes you smart. So it's very much, and we can all unpack here, right? Probably that it's neither of them and both can do both. So how do we do that? How do we engage with that from a very young age? So I think there is the potential to just put the plug for positioning theory here to really engage in all these conversations, beautiful that we've had today, around this construct of a theoretical framing that has so many generative constructs inside.
And I think that would be a beautiful last work. Unfortunately, the time has run out. So thank you again to the presenters for two very, very thoughtful and inspiring talks. And I hope we can continue the conversation about these issues later, perhaps at the conference in Finland or something like that. And I hope to see a lot of you the next time for the next presentations as well. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.
Well, thank you for your wonderful leadership.
Oh, I don't know. I hate that. You can stop
You-
recording now.